Hey everybody, hope you had a good Thanksgiving. Just getting back, wrapping up my Google Slides presentation here on tort law. I'm going to keep this brief and go through the cases that I looked at and give you a brief overview of all those things. Again, tort law is a civil law, and what it means here is we are looking for damages caused by loss or harm. Obviously, those damages are typically monetary. There's a couple of different types of torts, as you'll see here in my presentation. There are intentional torts, and with intentional torts, a lot of times they're wanting to prove malice or willful wanton, a cause or an intention to hurt somebody. Battery is actually an example of that, where you actually physically hit somebody, whether that's with your own body or with an object. Whereas assault is actually just causing fear of imminent harm or bodily harm, and causing that person to be afraid, which I actually didn't even know. I kind of just assumed they were two in the same. And false imprisonment is another one, and you see this in education in the means of different timeout methods. I know in the YouTube videos that we watched, they talked about timeout closets and having kids in there when they have potentially issues with claustrophobia and some other things, and how those could be considered intentional, and probably would not be good situation to find yourself in. And then the last one, which is actually pretty tough to prove, is intentionally causing emotional distress, and the person filing the complaint or the tort in regards to emotional distress has to actually prove that it caused them a loss or some sort of a harm that they could not recover from. So some things to keep in mind. Another type of tort is negligence, which is actually one of the more common ones. And this is typically associated with an individual having a duty or responsibility to protect someone or owe them that care, and then not carrying that out. And again, that's one of the more common ones that you'll see. The third one here is strict liability. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up was defamation. There's two types of defamation identified in the research. Slander is written, slander is spoken defamation. And this is something done to try to falsely misrepresent or harm someone's character. And then libel would be a form of defamation through written expression. So let's see. The first case that I looked at was Flanagan versus Canton, and you can see my little picture here that I drew. What actually ended up happening is there was long story short, there was a situation here in the PE classroom or in the gymnasium. The class was rowdy. The teacher sent the kids to the locker room at the end of class and kept a couple kids back just to talk to them about their behavior. In the 2 to 3 minutes that he stood in the gym talking to the couple kids that stayed back, another kid in the locker room got pushed down. He hit his head on the lockers and then his abdomen on the bench, and ended up having to have a appendectomy. And as a result, the parents tried to sue the school, for negligence. And actually, the Supreme Court came back and overruled an earlier court's ruling, and stated that the teacher did not put the kid in any situation where there was an imminent opportunity for harm, or there was nothing that they could have prevented from that, and that what had happened was within his scope, as his job as a PE teacher. And so they reversed that and found that he didn't have any responsibility in that fact. And again, the reason for that was that the situation at hand could not be foreseen, and because of such that he couldn't actively have prevented it from that standpoint. So I thought that was a pretty interesting situation. And oddly enough, I did find a lot of different cases with PE and sports related. And I think just because of the nature of those atmospheres, and something they talked about on the PowerPoint about labs and PE classrooms and those types of things, and how when students are doing things that are a little bit more dangerous in nature, there's an increased need for supervision and intentionality through instruction to make sure kids remain safe. So anyway, the second case I ran into here is Hall versus Jones. And this is actually kind of an interesting deal. So the PE teacher left his classroom to go talk to the other PE teacher or give her a message about something. And in the meantime, a fight broke out. Upon returning, the teacher went to break up the fight, and then a third party got involved. And through everything, one of the kids ended up getting slammed into the metal bleachers and caused some head trauma. 2 years later, the mother tried to sue the school and the PE teacher, and she actually dropped the lawsuit against the school, um, as they stated, some sort of an exemption on Alabama state law. But as the teacher tried to get that same exemption, the teacher actually continued to press against Jones here in this case, and was able to win her case because the teacher left those kids unsupervised and therefore did not fall under the protection guidelines that were set in that law. So, if this happened at my school, I could only imagine what the teacher would face, some sort of a discipline. There's got to be clear expectations as to their exact responsibilities, especially when you're dealing with supervision in locker rooms, and PE gyms and laboratories and those types of things. I think it's important to be proactive, and obviously one of the biggest things there is to have clear communication expectations for all your teachers. Make sure teachers know what can happen if they leave kids unsupervised, and more importantly, I think it's important to make sure they know why it's important to maintain constant supervision and not to leave any students unaccompanied or unsupervised. The third case I looked at was Levesque versus Ducey, and this is kind of a flip case, if you will. And what actually happened in this case is the superintendent was talking to some students of various ethnic backgrounds, and there were some things misunderstood or misrepresented about what he said. A news paper published an article misquoting him that was later picked up by the local Fox News channel. And all in all, I guess in summary, they were saying things that he didn't say that were offensive to the Muslim culture. And when he came back and said that he didn't say it, even though they retracted the statement and issued an apology, he still went on to sue them. And the judge actually ruled against him, saying that there was no malice or ill intent behind what was being said, and so that he would not qualify for any damages in this situation. If this happened at our school, it's kind of hard to imagine what would happen. I work in a bigger district, and I could imagine that there'd be an immediate release of information, clearing up any confusion. I'm sure that at some level there would be lawyers and high level district personnel involved with the news channel and trying to clear that up as quickly as possible. Some things to be proactive about. I think it's important to always speak intentionally, to make sure you think out what you're saying. When you look at having meetings or interviews or different things, I think a good safeguard for a lot of that is to record those meetings, whether it's through a video or audio device. And I think when possible, I think it's important to meet in groups versus one-on-one to protect yourself from any of those situations that could arise. The next one here actually did happen in my school district. Now, this was before I was here, but this is Barrett versus USD 259, and this is something that happened at a football practice. A young man had a heat stroke. Long story short, had a heat stroke, rushed to the emergency room, ended up passing away. The mother went on to try to sue the school and the coach. And through that process and through reading the case, I was able to discover that she was denied damages based on the fact that it was an extracurricular activity. The school was exempt against any such negligence, and then also they really hit hard on the fact that it was not willful or intentional, and couldn't prove that wanton or intentional negligence, and that everything that the coaches and everything that everybody did that was involved in this situation was at the time what was expected of them, and was above the minimum standard for that profession. Proactively looking at this, over the last 6 years that I've been here in the district, I've seen every year an increase in the guidelines, not only at the district level but also at the state level. as far as awareness and prevention of heat illnesses and other life-threatening issues associated with athletics. That includes CPR, first aid, learning how to use the AED devices in our school, and so on and so forth. So, the sad reality of these situations as they've continued to occur over the last, 20, 30 years or whatever, is that through these hard situations, I think everybody learns how to be better and be safer, and take the right precautions to keep kids safe and healthy, and to avoid these situations. So, again, proactively, I think it's important to continue to learn, continue to grow, and continue to place the well-being of the child above everything else. Probably one of my favorite stories or cases here, rather, and you can see my little picture art I made here, but Frame versus Comier. And What actually happened in this situation was a gentleman was subbing in the classroom upon the request of another teacher. There was some sort of a disturbance, and he had asked several of the students to leave the classroom, and then the rest of them started taking the test. One of the students started talking out loud during the test. I think he had been warned once or twice. Upon the second or third time, the teacher walked up and asked him to leave. The student kind of was being difficult and refusing to get up and get out and leave the classroom. Um, when the student finally did get out of his desk or his chair, he stood in face to face with the instructor, and almost in a confrontational way. And according to the case, immediately the substitute instructor grabbed him by the shoulder and directed him backwards towards the door, causing the student to stumble into a piece of furniture there, and then escorted him the rest of the way out of the classroom. The next day, the substitute teacher had been informed that the parents had called the police and filed battery charges, or assault charges, excuse me, against the teacher. Um, this case ended up getting dismissed, and no damages were rewarded. The court actually found that the teacher was acting within his rights, and in an effort to continue to have a productive learning environment free of disruption, and that the force that was used was, what's the word they used? Was It wasn't overboard. Let's say it was a reasonable force. And so, again, I thought that was a pretty interesting story. Reactive, I think immediately in my mind, like, oh my goodness, if this happened at my school, I couldn't believe what would happen, to the teacher in question. They'd probably be brought in for a sit down with the administration. It'd be hard to say what would happen after that. I know contractually, and looking in our handbook, teachers have a right to protect, the classroom, other students, and themselves from physical harm. They also have the right to protect, school equipment and property from physical harm or from harm from other students. It just seems to be like a real gray area. Something that you definitely want to be careful with, for sure. Um, Proactively, I think it's something you should always do is just have clear communication, expectations, and then reinforcing those expectations. Expectations don't mean much if um, they're not being reinforced at the top. So that's kind of my big deal with a lot of these. Teachers must also be trained in strategies and techniques to reach desired solutions without escalating problems. The situation in the classroom, I feel like it probably could have been handled a little better, a little differently. Um, and we see teachers every day that handle it, in a way that's more desirable, and then we see teachers, unfortunately, that overreact and turn small situations into big situations. So I think appropriate training and follow through with those things is important and vital, with the ever changing world of education that we're in these days. Um, Benefits of professional and ethical standards in regards to torts. I think professional and ethical standards have to be designed, and though they're designed with several factors in mind. Obviously, there's legal aspects to that. There's, respective professions have different things that they need to look at when they're thinking about what kind of standards, what kind of ethics are involved with their certain career paths. In this case, when we're talking about education, you can't just limit it to only, tort liability or tort laws, but you also have to be cognizant of such laws and case rulings and how they affect the day-to-day operations of the educational institute. um, while it's easy to say we should monitor this through the use of common sense and that teachers are professionals and we don't need to go over all these things because they should know and it's an expectation. I think we really do our students and our staff not only a disservice but an injustice by assuming those things. I think it's very, very important, as I've said before, to have clear expectations. Um, they need to reflect our belief system, and they need to be carried out and enforced daily across the board, from the top of administration all the way down, through the staff and students. Having and operating with a high standard of professionalism and ethical standards will help minimize not only the tort liability issues, but adversely, I think it impacts productivity. I think it helps the learning environment as a whole, and I think it really just benefits the school in general. And what I mean by that is when everybody knows that they're held to a high standard, everybody knows what the expectation is, and those expectations are designed, for student safety, student success, rigor, and all those things that go into the classroom. Um, I think it's easier to push forward. The old saying of shoot for the moon and land amongst the stars. I think the higher you set those expectations, the better off you're going to be in the long run. But again, as I said earlier, setting expectations without follow through is a waste of everybody's time. So, having high expectations, communicating those clearly, and then obviously following through across the board with students, staff, and administration alike, to have as productive as a learning environment as possible. So again, that all goes to those professional and ethical standards, but again with the follow through as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation. I try to keep it short and sweet here. I know last time I did this, I got a little feedback from everybody that it was a little too long and wordy. So hopefully it was better for you. Again, hope you enjoyed your Thanksgiving. A couple more weeks of school left here. Let's finish strong. Thanks.